Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Bill Bender, the Senior Vice President for Strategic Accounts and Government Relations at Leidos. Bill, it's good to have you with us.
Thanks. It's great to be with you. Thank you.
And somehow this whole idea of cloud seems to overlay a lot of initiatives, a lot of imperatives in the government, and especially for the military. The need for more up-to-date software factory processes, the need for more decision-oriented, speed-oriented systems and networks, and you can go on and on and on. So let's start with the realities the Air Force and the Space Force are facing as they try to really get back that competitive strategic offset, and you have some experience in that realm too.
Yeah, I think in terms of the context for which we're trying to do the cloud development and migration for the services writ large, not unique to the Air Force, some of the realities out there, first and foremost, you've got this explosion of data happening, and there's a recognition that at the end of the day, the government, probably the thing they own the most of is data. There's no limit to it. They have a lot of work to do in order to try to glean insights from it, maybe better business processes, better mission outcomes. They believe, and I believe, that the insights are there, but they have to, curate the data, manage the data. And cloud infrastructure allows you to do that at speed and at scale. So that's one aspect of it. I think another reality is that, everybody's doing more with less. And so they're faced with trying to improve their ability to get positive mission outcomes, but to do so smarter, cheaper, faster. It really speaks to the need, again, for speed and scale. Scale being sort of the size, the complexity, the reach, but speed really getting to those keen insights and better decisions faster inside of a decision cycle of maybe a would-be adversary. And I think a third reality that government IT leaders are faced with today, even with a migration to the cloud, is really one around a hybrid environment. A lot of the legacy systems, I know that when I was the CIO of the Air Force, it's the same system today where you're really having to make tough choices around what is a good candidate to go to the cloud, because there's no guarantee that it's going to actually be more affordable when you get there if you're dealing with, sort of legacy processes and architectures inside of that. And so the reality is it's going to be hybrid, and it's going to be a long journey to get to modernize IT in the future. You have to contend with what you have today all along.
And you mentioned that explosion of data, and somehow all decision-making, and whether it's 5-year budget planning or some kind of a combat or tactical situation, it's all about the data. And so it seems like the services, as probably most federal agencies, have done a lot of spending and work on the infrastructure to hold and manage data, but not so much on the way to fuse it, the artificial intelligence, the curating of sets for a specific purpose, only maybe to be used for a few minutes and then dissipated again back to storage. So it seems like there's a function missing between storage and decision making.
Yeah, and I think that what I see government very often being perplexed by is they envision the use of artificial intelligence at the extreme, meaning at its very mature state of maybe autonomous systems. And then you face challenges around, well, is that going to displace our workforce? Or, what is the union going to think about that? And these are, as a practical matter, there's a long road ahead for implementation, use of AI. So, for example, the methodology that you might really think about is in terms of first, automation of of analytics at the very, beginning, and then maybe some kind of human assistance, and then finally augmentation, and eventually autonomy. So there's a cycle that has to take place, and you really start from where you are, and I think very often it's just about helping humans do better, move faster, get more done in the environment that they're in. And so we have a little bit, in industry, we have a little bit of effort required on sort of that journey through AI, and I think that it's resonating and it's understood, but the methodology has to start, sort of crawl, walk, run in nature.
And there is a human factor, as you mentioned, the thought that people think they might be displaced, but that's probably a misplaced fear, because even as the military thinks about uncrewed and unmanned systems, whether in the air or on the sea or beneath the sea, I don't think anyone envisions them not being under the supervision of a human being, even if that person is not in the cockpit.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean the thing is making decisions autonomously.
That's right, and you bring up a very key point there. And AI is useless if we don't trust what we are sort of allowing the human-machine interface to happen. And so a lot of work has to be done to make sure that the various attributes of AI in terms of resiliency, accuracy, security, all of the ITs really have to be addressed in the tech stack, but there is the human element as well. And so I think the combination of technology and methodology in terms of how you think about the problem, what is trusted AI, and it really is this notion of working your way through analytics and then assistance and finally all the way through to autonomy, but also a trusted technology stack that changes contextually to the situation you're in. So if you're driving an automated vehicle, it doesn't do you any good if it stops keeping you safe when it rains outside. The context has changed. And so we have to really engineer in, if you will, those safety nets and understanding of contextually what can change. And then it has to be adaptive over time. So easy, design of an open architecture. I think that at Leidos we try to think, generally speaking, in terms of truly open architecture, the equivalency of a plug and play type of thing, so that come one, come all, anybody can plug into this platform. And then very importantly, non-proprietary solutions. You're not being locked in to something because you chose to do business with one industry player or another. And then finally, the government, going back to your first question around this explosion of data, the government owns the data and they own the data rights and all the IP. That is not something that industry should have a stake in. We want to provide your ability to do better with understanding what your data holds and the insights that you can glean from it.
And a lot of this implies the idea of adaptable systems that recognize context, kind of back up to the idea of software development, because those are all expressions of software programs.
Yeah.
And that gets to the idea of an initiative, I think, that's starting to take root in the Pentagon, and that is the software factory idea.
Right.
So how can the industry, the big industry partners, help the agencies get to that idea of finally getting past the waterfall, the monolithic, the non-adaptive? In some ways, that's the definition of artificial intelligence.
Yeah,
it does adapt.
I'm very proud of the Air Force's efforts, and now Space Force, with this proliferation of software factories across the Air Force. That actually has happened in the last 5 or 6 years or so. And on the front end of it, as a CIO, it was a sort of a risk-informed decision that we can't keep doing business in this waterfall method, and we have to scale our ability to develop software. Actually, it's ubiquitous in every mission system that we have, and it's the way that you're going to modernize IT. It's all software defined. And so to your point, what can industry do to help? Of course, there's a tremendous shortage of capable people, so the talent aspect of it, where you have software developers, and so augmentation, partnering with government to help them develop faster and more complex solutions. I think another area is bringing the very best of commercial and bridging it into defense applications. We've heard forever throughout an entire career how impossible it was to cross the valley of death from commercial into defense. The reality is that it's not a technology problem today. It's actually more of a cultural and a business process. And so adaptation of commercial systems for defense use is an area where industry's been doing that a long time, and working now with government to help them make better sense of where you don't have to give up on security or mission effectiveness. You can actually use this open architecture and plug and play with best-in-class commercial solutions for defense applications.
And can a broad-based supplier like Leidos, which is primarily a federal contractor, help with that valley of death? Because very often trying to do business directly with the federal government, even now, even with OTA money and so forth, is difficult for small companies. And sometimes they just opt not to try to traverse the fields that it takes to be able to get to that handshake in a contract. But it seems like that could be a really good function through subcontracting for someone with the view that a large company like Leidos has across industry.
This is one of those, if I knew then what I know now, I would have actually probably been more effective as the Air Force CIO, because there was maybe a failure to understand the criticality of leveraging industry in the way that you just described. As a company, as an industry, we really need to solve very complex, unique, one-of-a-kind solutions that scale globally. And this is where your point about even the very exquisite tech developers, small businesses and others, maybe would be crushed under the weight of government bureaucracy and how difficult it is to do business. They have to pay people at the end of every month. And so there's a partnership that I believe is necessary, where Leidos and other systems integrators and large companies, they don't lack for innovation. They really are on the same team in terms of trying to solve big problems that lead to national security concerns. And so it's working together. And I'm a strong proponent of government-industry partnership, and I think there's a really key role that the large defense contractor systems integrators can play in, if you will, mentoring and sort of helping the smalls through the process so that they don't get crushed by the weight of government bureaucracy and that type of thing.
Yeah, when you abstract that whole process and be the front end for those companies facing the government, it's a little different than the traditional subcontractors, where it's a matter of meeting at an AFCEA luncheon, and they know you, you know them, and everybody knows what everybody does. This is to bring in the real innovation that may just simply not be available to the DoD from its standpoint.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of work taking place within, the Air Force, for example, with pitch days and trying to inspire, entrepreneurial efforts and finding them. But to your point, I think that it's really this requirement to work together, right? So we can partner with, we can support, we can actually give more of capability in terms of shared efforts in order to getting to the desired outcome. And the government ends up getting the innovation that they want, but they don't stand the chance of losing that to just sort of the complexity of the environment that you're asking this small, who may have never done any business with the government, to actually come in and in some cases scale that to a global customer.
So let's back up here and kind of raise the altitude a little bit. What does a transformed digitally enterprise look like, something like the Air Force? Because we've talked about digital infrastructure, we've talked about cybersecurity, we've talked about speed of decision making, software acquisition. What does it all add up to? What does a transformed enterprise look like?
Well, it's all of those things. So primarily it's a cloud environment where you're leveraging sort of somebody else's provisioned, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Googles provisioned software so that you don't have that cost of refresh every 2 or 3 years. You are counting on those commercial entities to keep current and to take advantage of the latest technologies, so that you have this iterative evolving as opposed to sort of stasis over a period of time, and the next time it comes through a refresh cycle, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, so that you don't get to the point where you're, sort of 1 or 2 or 3 or many iterations behind the next advance in technology. So there's an aspect of it there. I think it's, this whole notion of dependability around your IT requirements. So, the proverbial, I used to stand up in an Air Force crowd and say, what's the last time you lost connectivity on your Gmail? And they, used to get a couple of snickers because I was responsible for the email in the government system, and it was failing on a daily, hourly basis. And so it's really taking advantage of best commercial practices, their investment for your purposes. And I think between cloud and microservices, software-defined everything, I mean, that's ultimately what we're talking about when you're talking a digitally transformed infrastructure. I think the last point I'd make, Tom, and it's a key one, and that is understanding how to manage at an enterprise level. Many of these digitally transformed capabilities can be managed much faster, cheaper, more efficiently, and more effectively because technology is no longer the problem. These cloud-based solutions scale globally instantaneously, so you can make decisions at one level and implement it at many levels instantaneously. And so when you get to that point, you've digitally transformed the services that we have today.
Yeah, that gets to the question about, say, an effort like JADC2. Does that really support this whole idea? Because I can think back to the days there was an Air Force CIO probably 25, 30 years ago who said, for the price of one bomber, I could wire the entire Air Force. The idea was cable would be owned by the Air Force, and you'd have the monolithic cable system of fiber. I don't think people think that way these days. So,
I'm only happy to hear that he wasn't successful. That would not be good. Yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely does get to the larger point in terms of JADC2 is a data problem to solve. It's any shooter, any sensor, any target, anywhere across this world, and it's still a data problem because really those sensors will exist, can exist from multiple different platforms and in different ways, but heretofore we haven't really thought through the ability to fuse that data and to draw insights. So with the developments associated with cloud instantiated capabilities, with artificial intelligence that is able to quickly manipulate and distill data into insights, and the ability to then transmit anywhere along, sort of self-forming, self-healing networks that are also technically available to us, think in terms of 5G and others. So we don't have the limitations we once did. So I was, even prior to my retirement, I talked very often publicly, this is not a technology problem anymore. So we used to aspire to the ability to connect any platform at any time because we knew the power that would give you of information management and putting it where you need on target, and the ability to make decisions at a leadership level, and then to distill that down to those who are executing. That's no longer technologically not possible, but there are still some challenges with how we buy IT and how we culturally organize along hierarchical lines and things. So a lot of the business processes and the trappings of how we do Air Force business need to change along with the technology advances that are happening.
Yeah, the theme I'm hearing under all of this is the idea of XYZ as a service. I mean, even if you look at a software factory, there's coding going on, but to the recipient of the software, it almost looks like software development as a service. And I guess that's true for all of these other capabilities and technologies. You've talked about EIT as a service. Maybe expound on that one a little bit.
Yeah, so enterprise IT as a service, as a concept, started again when I was, the Air Force CIO, and it had been a recognition that we no longer had the, sort of the money in the budget to provision for ourselves, and so we wanted to take advantage of commercially provided, very resilient, very secure infrastructure for those areas where we could, at least conceptually, take the people who were doing that at a heavy lift and heavy cost away and put them to what I would call higher value work around the cybersecurity problem. In a way, cybersecurity became the silver lining for how we would transition to better IT infrastructure, because you couldn't live within your means. You weren't going to get more money and you weren't going to get more people, so you had to do things differently. And for us, differently was, let's allow a commoditization of IT with commercially provided, enterprise level and managed IT, and take the people that we were using to keep the lights on at all these post camps and stations, and instead put them against the cybersecurity problem. And generally speaking, that's the journey that the Air Force is on today, and I think it's been, successful, but it's still got a long way to go.
Almost a 21st century version of the EDS model.
Yes.
But you still needed that chops within your own organization, even if you did outsource a lot of the computer software and hardware, even back in those days.
Yeah, the fine line was always retaining enough of the expertise for when you go to war, because you're not typically going to take AT&T, with you to war. Not saying that you can't use the infrastructure that's present out in whatever theater, but generally speaking, you need to partner with industry so that you really understand how to keep it maintained and sustained and fully provisioned in a wartime environment. But day to day, running the business of the Air Force, it made great sense and still does to go to an enterprise level, sort of offering.
And it's always good to have that knowledge when it comes time to negotiate the contracts too.
This is true, yes.
And we should talk about the Space Force, because that's the new one that's still kind of forming itself. They're still taking in billets, and we wouldn't want the Space Force to end up a mini rest of the forces with all of the baggage they're trying to get out from under. So what are your thoughts on a already modernized Space Force such that it can be as agile as we need it to be?
I think as the Space Force, sort of branches off on their own, they're well led and continuously messaging the desire to fast forward into modern IT infrastructure. They have a determined adversary who has significantly shortened the cycle from from concept to launch, and sort of making the space domain one that had been benign to a threatened environment. So they recognize the national security concerns, and so they absolutely have an imperative to move faster. And so some of what they're taking on, I believe, are some of these newer concepts, and they have the latitude as a new service to actually, just go right from there and skip the first part where you're dealing with more legacy. They're certainly determined. I think that the challenge that they may have is more around acquisition decisions that they'll make. Pristine, well-developed, very complex, 20 years to build to the tune of billions of dollars and put them in space, and the recognition that they're still at risk from the determined adversary really has you thinking differently about use of commercial and a proliferation of affordable, evolutionary types of systems that are out there. And so they're leading absolutely a change of space, right in front of our eyes in terms of much more use of commercial, and I think it's good. It's good for the nation.
And finally, we've been talking about all of these developments in terms of digital transformation, but really isn't that just a route, and the most efficacious route, to military superiority, which is what the nation is trying to claw its way to maintain right now?
Yeah, I think there's a recognition that, our adversaries, especially our peer adversaries, have been watching the U.S. for 20, 25 years, and they understand our advantages around our ability to pick up and prosecute the war on somebody else's turf. And so they're looking at the soft underbelly or the underpinnings. And as I mentioned earlier, where IT is concerned, it's ubiquitous in every mission that we do. And so if you can negate through use of the cyberspace domain, if you can get inside of the U.S. decision cycle and somehow have us questioning the data and the insights and the information that we're getting, it's just as effective as a way of sort of keeping us from the way we would want to prosecute in the past. And so we recognize that, and we're rapidly correcting course. But it took us a long time to build up the strongest military in the world, and so there's a lot of sort of predispositions around the way that we've done more and been very successful. But so we're having to overcome some of those cultural challenges.
Well, thanks very much. Great discussion.
Yeah.
My guest today has been Bill Bender, the Senior Vice President for Strategic Accounts and Government Relations at Leidos. Now let me send you back to the studio for more on the DoD Cloud Exchange.